She was married to a billionaire. She lived in a mansion so big that her footsteps echoed when she walked. She had luxury cars, designer clothes, servants at her command. Everything a woman could ever dream of. But every night, she slept alone, and every morning, she woke up to silence. No laughter, no warmth, no love. Her husband was a powerful businessman and politician, always traveling, always chasing money, power, and influence across the world. He gave her everything except himself. And then one day, her husband's son came back home. Young, calm, handsome, full of life, full of attention, full of everything she had been missing. At first, it felt harmless. Just two people, sharing space in a lonely house. But slowly, the silence between them began to speak. The distance began to disappear. And what started as comfort turned into something they could no longer control. Because sometimes, love doesn't ask questions. It doesn't care about boundaries. It doesn't care about consequences. It just happens. And when it does, it can destroy everything. Adaobi lived in luxury, but her life felt like a quiet cage. Every morning, sunlight poured into the massive windows of her home, touching everything with warmth, except her heart. The house was always neat, always perfect, always silent. Too silent. The workers came and went, meals were prepared, clothes were arranged. Everything ran smoothly, but none of it mattered, because Adaobi had no one to share it with. She would often sit alone at the long dining table, staring at the empty chair in front of her, the chair that belonged to her husband, a man who once made her laugh, once held her close, once promised her a lifetime of love. Now, he was just a voice on the phone, a name that appeared briefly and disappeared even faster. At night, the loneliness became heavier. The large bed felt even bigger when only one person slept in it. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence wrap around her like a shadow. Sometimes, she would walk through the mansion slowly, touching the walls, the furniture, the decorations, as if trying to feel something, anything. But all she felt was emptiness. She had beauty, she had wealth, she had status. But deep inside, she was starving for love, and slowly, that hunger began to grow. Loneliness is quiet. It doesn't shout. It doesn't force itself. It creeps in slowly and settles deep inside the heart. Adaobi tried to ignore it. She told herself she was strong. She reminded herself that many women would dream of her life. She convinced herself that what she was feeling was just a phase. But the truth was, she was tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of waiting. Tired of loving someone who was never there. Her only comfort came from the few moments she spent with her friend, who noticed the sadness hidden behind her beauty. It was becoming harder to hide. Because loneliness, when ignored for too long, begins to change a person. It makes the heart restless. It creates a space that desperately wants to be filled. And when that moment comes, when something or someone finally fills that space, it feels like relief. It feels like peace. It feels like life returning again. But not every kind of relief is safe. The day everything changed started like every other day. Quiet, predictable, lonely. But by evening, fate had already begun to move. A car drove into the compound. Nothing unusual, but something about that moment felt different. Adaobi stood at the balcony, watching absent-mindedly as the gate opened and the car rolled in. She wasn't expecting anything. She wasn't waiting for anyone. But when the door opened and he stepped out, something shifted. He was tall, calm, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that was hard to ignore. There was something effortless about him, something natural and real. a sharp contrast to the cold, distant world Adaobi had grown used to. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and in that moment, time slowed. There was no love, not yet, but there was awareness, a presence, a feeling that something had just entered her life, something different, something alive. He walked into the house with ease, like someone who belonged there, yet brought a new energy with him. The quietness of the mansion suddenly felt less heavy, less empty. For the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel completely lifeless, and Adaobi, for the first time in a long while, felt something stir inside her. Something small, something soft, but something dangerous. Because sometimes, the things that feel the most innocent at the beginning are the ones that change everything in the end. He was just her stepson. Nothing more. Nothing complicated, nothing wrong. But life has a way of turning simple things into unforgettable stories. And this story was only just beginning. The morning after his arrival, she woke up the same way she always did. Slowly, without urgency, without excitement. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, touching her skin gently, but even that warmth could not reach the emptiness she carried inside. She sat up on the bed and listened, and for the first time, she heard something different. Movement, a door closing somewhere down the hall. Footsteps, soft, steady, alive. Her heart paused for a second. She didn't know why, but she knew one thing. She was no longer alone. That simple realization did something to her, something small, yet powerful. She stood up, adjusted her robe, and stepped out of her room. Her movements were calm, but inside, there was a quiet curiosity building. As she walked down the hallway, she noticed the house differently. It no longer felt like an empty space echoing her loneliness. It felt occupied, alive. She reached the staircase and paused. Downstairs she could hear him, not clearly, but enough to feel his presence, and without realizing it, a soft, almost shy smile formed on her face. The first real shift didn't come from something big. It came from something simple, unexpected, natural. She found him in the kitchen, not doing anything extraordinary, just standing there, pouring himself a drink, completely relaxed, completely at ease in a house that had always felt too heavy for comfort. For a brief moment, she stood there, watching. There was something about him, something calm, something warm, something real, very different from the cold, distant world she had grown used to. He turned slightly, sensing her presence. Their eyes met, and this time, the moment lasted longer. There was no awkwardness, no discomfort, just a quiet awareness of each other. And in that silence, something softened. Adaobi felt it clearly. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing eased. The tension she had carried for so long loosened. It was the first time in a long time that being around someone didn't feel like pressure. It felt easy, and that feeling was new. Days began to pass, but they didn't feel the same anymore. Time, which once dragged slowly through empty hours, now seemed to move with a quiet rhythm, a gentle flow. And in that flow, they found each other more often, not intentionally, but naturally. Sometimes it was in the living room where the silence was no longer uncomfortable. Sometimes it was in the dining area where meals didn't feel so lonely anymore. Sometimes it was just in passing. A glance, a brief moment, a shared space. But those small moments began to grow, and with each one, the connection deepened. Adaobi began to notice things she hadn't expected to notice. The way his presence filled a room without being loud. The way he carried himself with calm confidence. The way he listened, not just to words, but to emotions. And slowly, she began to feel something she had forgotten existed. Peace, real peace, the kind that doesn't come from money, or comfort, or luxury, but from simply not feeling alone. And then, it started showing, in her smile, in the way her eyes softened, in the way she laughed, light, genuine, free. For the first time in a long time, Adaobi was not pretending to be okay. She actually felt it, and that scared her, because she knew this feeling had a source, and that source was standing right in front of her. It happened on a quiet evening, the kind of evening that usually felt endless and empty. But this time, it felt different. The sky outside was painted in soft shades of orange and gold as the sun slowly disappeared. The house was calm, wrapped in a peaceful silence that no longer felt heavy. Adaobi sat alone at first, but not for long. He joined her. And just like that, the space between them changed. There was no effort, no tension, just a quiet, shared presence that felt natural, almost too natural. Time passed, slowly, gently, and in that stillness, something began to grow. They were no longer just sharing a house. They were sharing something deeper, something emotional, something unspoken. Adaobi could feel it, in the way her heart beat a little faster, in the way she became suddenly aware of how close he was, in the way the air around them felt warmer, heavier, charged. And then, it happened. A moment, small, simple, but impossible to ignore. Their hands brushed, just slightly, just for a second. But in that second, everything changed. Her breath caught, her heart raced, and time seemed to pause. It wasn't intentional, it wasn't planned, but the feeling it created was real, too real. She pulled back slightly, not out of anger, not out of fear, but because she understood. This was no longer harmless. This was no longer simple. This was something else, something deeper, something dangerous. Because in that one brief moment, comfort had crossed into something far more powerful, something that could not be undone, something that could not be ignored, something that was only just beginning. The mansion felt alive for the first time in months. Adaobi's heart raced whenever he was near. Every shared smile, every glance, every brush of the hand made her pulse quicken. It was dangerous, yet thrilling. They began to talk more intimately than ever before. What started as small, polite conversation grew into playful teasing. He would comment on her hair, her laugh, the way she always stirred her tea with delicate precision. She would laugh, teasing back about his serious expressions, his always calculating ways. Their words were light, but underneath each one was electricity. The air between them was charged, a secret shared in every glance, a warmth that belonged only to them. One rainy afternoon, the two of them found themselves alone in the living room. The rain tapped softly on the windows, a perfect backdrop for the heartbeats racing in silence. He looked at her, eyes soft, almost hesitant. "Why do I feel like I've known you forever?" he said, voice low. Her cheeks warmed. "Maybe because I've been waiting for someone who sees me." Their hands brushed, not by accident, and neither pulled away. It was a silent confession, saying more than words could. For the first time, Adaobi realized just how much she needed him, not physically, but emotionally. He was filling the emptiness she had carried for months, a secret warmth that no one else could give her. That evening, the tension became impossible to ignore. They were sitting closer than usual, a soft candlelight dancing across their faces. Every word felt loaded, every breath shared felt heavier. He leaned slightly closer, his hand brushing hers again. Their eyes met, long, intense, and filled with unspoken longing. Adaobi felt her chest tighten, heart hammering. For a moment, the world outside the mansion ceased to exist. And then, gently, almost as if testing the boundaries, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. It was soft, hesitant, sweet, and in that one kiss, everything changed. It was no longer innocent, no longer just comfort. It was desire, warmth, and emotional connection all at once. Their bodies drew closer, hearts beating in sync. The kiss ended, but the electricity lingered. Adaobi's breath caught, his eyes mirrored her own conflicted feelings. From that night, everything shifted. They began spending more time together, stealing moments when no one else was around. Quiet touches, lingering glances, and whispered conversations in empty hallways. Their connection was intimate and deeply emotional, always just beyond the line, never crossing into physicality forbidden by law and morality, but enough to make their hearts ache and pulse. Every encounter was a mix of thrill and fear. A shared joke, a gentle touch on the hand, sitting closer than necessary on the couch, all became precious moments in a secret world of their own. Every moment was intoxicating, yet shadowed by guilt. Adaobi would retreat to her room afterward, heart pounding, questioning her emotions. She knew this was wrong in the eyes of society, in the eyes of family, in the eyes of her husband. And yet, the pleasure of being seen, being understood, being cherished, it was unlike anything she had felt in years. He too felt the conflict, staring at her in quiet moments, knowing the danger, knowing the secret, yet unable to resist the pull of her warmth. Every stolen conversation, every gentle laugh, every touch carried both danger and ecstasy. And in that delicate balance, their secret affair began. And now, the story pauses. But the conversation begins in part 2. What would you do if your heart wanted something dangerous, forbidden, and beautiful all at the same time? Comment your thoughts below the comment section. End of part 1. You won't believe what happens next. Will she follow her heart or destroy everything? Find out in part 2. Before you go, like this video, drop your opinion in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the next part.